This is Chatham, New Jersey, the summer of 1781. Bake ovens are rising along the ridgeline. Boats are gathering on the riverbanks. Every signal points to one target, New York City. But the army camped here has no intention of attacking New York at all. What the British were about to witness wasn't a build-up to battle. It was the greatest con of the American Revolution. What happened next would decide the fate of an entire war, and the British would not understand they had been fooled until it was far too late. This is the story of the deception that ended an empire's grip on America. By the spring of 1781, the American Revolution had ground into its sixth brutal year. The economy was collapsing, the currency was worthless, and the Continental Army was starving in its own country. Independence no longer felt inevitable. It felt like it might simply run out of time. George Washington had spent years dreaming of one target above all others: New York City, the beating heart of British power in North America. He believed retaking it would end the war in a single stroke. Every plan he drafted that spring bent toward that single ambition. New York was no ordinary city. It was the most heavily fortified position in British North America, defended by thousands of regulars, warships, and earthworks built over 5 years of occupation. Taking it outright would cost more lives than Washington's army could afford to lose. Enter the Comte de Rochambeau, commander of France's expeditionary force in America. Older, more cautious, and far more experienced in continental warfare than Washington, Rochambeau quietly disagreed with the entire New York obsession. He believed the real opportunity for a war-ending victory lay somewhere else entirely. 1,500 miles south, a different British army was tearing through Virginia. Lord Cornwallis, fresh from his campaigns in the Carolinas, had marched his exhausted force deep into Virginia's tidewater country, chasing an elusive American resistance he could never quite pin down and destroy. Cornwallis was growing frustrated. Virginia offered no decisive battle, no captured capital, no clean victory to report to London. Increasingly, he looked toward the Chesapeake coastline, searching for a defensible port where his army could rest, resupply, and wait for new orders. That search led him to a small tobacco port on the York River, Yorktown. Cornwallis began fortifying the position in the summer of 1781, unaware that this seemingly minor decision would soon trap his entire army against the water, with nowhere left to run. In May of 1781, Washington and Rochambeau met in Connecticut to plan the campaign season. Washington pushed hard for New York. Rochambeau listened, nodded politely, and quietly held something back, a piece of information Washington did not yet have. Rochambeau knew that a powerful French fleet under Admiral de Grasse was operating in the Caribbean, and that de Grasse had signaled a willingness to sail north later that summer. If timed correctly, that fleet could control the Chesapeake Bay itself, sealing off any British escape by sea. This was the key Rochambeau had been withholding. A land army alone could trap Cornwallis at Yorktown, but without naval control of the bay, the British could simply evacuate by ship the moment things turned dangerous. The Navy had to arrive first, and it had to arrive unseen. Through the early summer, letters crossed the Atlantic and the American countryside, carrying one central question: would de Grasse sail for New York or for the Chesapeake? The answer would determine everything, and neither general could move until it arrived. In early August, the answer finally came. De Grasse would sail north with nearly 30 warships and 3,000 additional troops, but he would not go to New York. He was heading straight for the Chesapeake, and he could only remain there until mid-October. For Washington, this was the hardest decision of the war. He would have to abandon the target he had wanted for 5 years, march his entire army hundreds of miles on a razor-thin timeline, and gamble everything on a French fleet arriving exactly when promised. By mid-August, Washington made his choice. The armies would march south toward Virginia. But there was an immediate, catastrophic problem. If the British in New York saw thousands of troops leaving camp and heading south, they would know exactly where the danger was headed. Sir Henry Clinton, the British commander in New York, had spies embedded throughout Washington's camp and along every major road in the region. Any sudden movement south would be reported within days. Cornwallis would evacuate Yorktown long before the trap could close. Washington and Rochambeau realized the march itself would not be the hardest part of the plan. Keeping Clinton convinced that New York was still the target, right up until the moment it no longer mattered, would be the true test of the entire campaign. So, the generals built a lie. Bake ovens large enough to feed an army preparing for a long siege. Boats gathered along riverbanks as if for a crossing onto British-held Staten Island. Every visible sign pointed toward one conclusion. New York was still coming. Letters were drafted, describing detailed plans for an assault on New York. Letters that were never meant to reach their addressed recipients. They were meant to fall into British hands instead, carried by rioters who took routes almost guaranteed to be intercepted. By late August, the march began. Thousands of American and French soldiers stepped off from their camps near New York, and every single one of them, from privates to junior officers, believed they were maneuvering for an attack on the city. Only the generals knew the truth. Clinton received the intercepted letters exactly as planned. He read reports of bake ovens, boats, and troop movements consistent with an assault on Staten Island. He began reinforcing New York's defenses, convinced the coming battle would be fought on his own doorstep. The Allied army crossed the Hudson River in the final days of August, moving south along routes designed to keep Clinton guessing for as long as possible. Even as thousands of men and wagons rumbled past, the destination remained a closely guarded secret. Most soldiers in the ranks had no idea where they were actually headed. Rumors spread through the column daily. Some believed they would turn toward Staten Island any hour. Others whispered about a much longer march. The uncertainty itself became part of the disguise. For several critical days, the marching columns moved close enough to New York's outer defenses that a British sortie could have exposed the entire operation. Every mile covered without discovery was a small victory. Every mile still ahead was a growing risk. British scouts did observe the movement, but the reports that reached Clinton were confused and contradictory. Some described troops heading toward Staten Island exactly as the forged letters had promised. Others hinted at a longer southward march, but Clinton dismissed them as unlikely. Clinton faced a genuine dilemma. Reinforcing Cornwallis in Virginia meant weakening New York at the exact moment intelligence suggested an imminent attack. He chose caution. He held his troops in place, convinced the greater danger was still sitting directly in front of him. By early September, with New York now safely behind them, the columns finally turned decisively southwest. The ruse had bought exactly what it needed: enough time and enough confusion for the true direction of the march to become undeniable and unstoppable. At almost the same moment, Admiral de Grasse's French fleet arrived in the Chesapeake Bay exactly as promised. Nearly 30 warships and thousands of additional troops began taking position at the mouth of the bay, quietly sealing off Cornwallis's only route of escape by sea. British Admiral Thomas Graves sailed south from New York with his own fleet, hoping to relieve Cornwallis before the trap could close completely. What he found waiting at the mouth of the Chesapeake was a French battle line, already prepared and ready to fight. The Battle of the Chesapeake unfolded over several brutal hours in early September. Neither side achieved a decisive tactical victory in the traditional sense, but strategically, the outcome was total. Graves withdrew north, and the bay remained firmly under French control. That single naval engagement sealed Cornwallis's fate before a single siege gun had even been positioned at Yorktown. With the sea route closed, his army was now cut off from resupply, reinforcement, and evacuation, though he did not yet fully grasp how completely. Inside Yorktown, Cornwallis continued strengthening his defenses, still expecting relief or evacuation to come by sea at any moment. He had no reliable way of knowing that the fleet meant to save him had already been turned away, and that an entire army was closing in by land. The Allied march south covered nearly 700 miles in a matter of weeks, an extraordinary logistical achievement for an 18th century army. Supply lines stretched thin, disease and exhaustion took their toll, but morale climbed with every mile, because word had finally spread. This time, the destination was real. At the head of the Chesapeake, French transport ships ferried the final legs of the army south by water, dramatically speeding up what would otherwise have taken additional weeks by land. Washington himself boarded one of these vessels, watching the coastline of Virginia finally come into view. For Washington, arriving in Virginia meant something deeply personal. Mount Vernon, his own home, sat only a short distance away, a place he had not seen in over 6 years. There was little time to stop. The campaign that would decide the war was only beginning. By late September, nearly 19,000 American and French troops had converged on Yorktown from land and sea, encircling Cornwallis's roughly 9,000 exhausted defenders. The trap that Rochambeau had first imagined months earlier was now fully closed around the British Army. The formal siege began in early October. Allied troops dug parallel trenches under cover of darkness, inching closer to the British lines night after night, while heavy artillery was slowly and quietly maneuvered into position for the bombardment that was about to begin. Inside Yorktown, Cornwallis finally understood the scale of what he faced. There would be no relief fleet. There was no path of retreat by land. His army was surrounded on every side, and the only ships in sight now belonged entirely to the enemy. British officers inside the town began to grasp the trap's full elegance. The bake ovens, the forged letters, the boats gathered near New York. None of it had been preparation for an attack there at all. It had all been built to buy time for this. Back in New York, Clinton finally understood the deception in full. The bake ovens sat cold. The boats remained unused. The army he had spent weeks preparing to fight had marched hundreds of miles south, while he waited for an attack that was never coming. By the time Clinton organized a relief expedition and finally set sail for Virginia, the siege at Yorktown was already weeks old. His fleet would arrive far too late to change anything. The deception had not just bought time, it had decided the entire campaign. On October 9th, the full bombardment of Yorktown began. American and French guns opened fire in a coordinated barrage that shook the ground for miles. Cornwallis's defenses, already stretched thin, began crumbling under a relentless and increasingly accurate rain of artillery fire. Two key British redoubts, numbered 9 and 10, blocked the final approach to the town's inner defenses. Taking them would allow the Allies to close the siege lines completely. Both sides understood that whoever controlled those two positions would control the outcome of the siege. On the night of October 14th, American light infantry stormed Redoubt 10 in a swift, silent bayonet assault, refusing to load their muskets to avoid alerting the defenders early. French troops simultaneously struck Redoubt 9. Both positions fell within minutes at a shockingly low cost. The fall of those two redoubts allowed Allied artillery to close the final gap in the siege lines. From that point forward, every remaining British position inside Yorktown lay within direct and devastating range of enemy guns. There was nowhere left inside the town to hide. With his position collapsing, Cornwallis attempted one final desperate gamble. On the night of October 16th, he tried to ferry his army across the York River under cover of darkness, hoping to break out and march north before the Allies could react. A sudden, violent storm shattered the attempt before it could even properly begin. Boats were scattered and driven back by wind and rain, and the escape collapsed into disorder. It was the last realistic option Cornwallis had, and nature itself closed the door on it. By October 17th, conditions inside Yorktown had become unbearable. Food and ammunition were running dangerously low. Disease was spreading through the crowded defenses, and the constant bombardment had reduced entire sections of the town's fortifications to rubble. Cornwallis had run out of options. That morning, a lone drummer climbed onto the British ramparts, beating a call for a parley, the traditional signal requesting a ceasefire to discuss terms. The bombardment slowly fell silent. After weeks of relentless siege, Cornwallis had decided to negotiate the surrender of his entire army. Negotiations stretched over 2 days, as representatives from both sides debated the terms of capitulation. Cornwallis requested the traditional honors of war for his surrendering troops. Washington, remembering the humiliating terms imposed on Americans at earlier defeats, refused to grant them in full. On October 19, 1781, the formal surrender took place on an open field outside Yorktown. Thousands of British and German troops marched between two long lines of American and French soldiers, laying down their weapons in a ceremony both sides understood as historic. Cornwallis himself did not attend the ceremony, citing illness, and sent a subordinate officer to surrender his sword in his place. Whether the excuse was genuine or a final gesture of wounded pride, the absence became one of the enduring details of that autumn afternoon. As the British marched out to lay down their arms, their military band reportedly played a mournful old tune, its title fitting the moment with almost theatrical precision. A quiet acknowledgement that the world these soldiers had known was about to change permanently. Clinton's relief fleet finally reached the Chesapeake 5 days after the surrender had already been signed. There was nothing left to save. The army that had marched south under the cover of a lie was already the victor, and the war in America was effectively over. When news of the surrender reached London weeks later, it landed like a thunderclap. Prime Minister Lord North reportedly reacted as though struck physically by the news. Political support for continuing the war in America collapsed almost overnight, And peace negotiations began not long after. Yorktown did not end the Revolutionary War on paper. Fighting continued in isolated pockets for nearly 2 more years. But militarily and politically, the campaign was decisive. Britain's will to continue the fight in America had been broken, not by force alone, but by deception. What made Yorktown remarkable was not simply the siege itself, but everything that made the siege possible. A convincing lie sustained for weeks, a precisely timed naval arrival, a 700-mile march completed on a schedule with almost no margin for error. 2 years later, in 1783, Britain formally recognized American independence. The empire that had once commanded the most powerful navy and army on earth had been outmaneuvered, not by matching its strength, but by convincing it to look the wrong way at exactly the right moment. The field at Yorktown is quiet now, marked by grassy earthworks and historical plaques where an army once vanished before the eyes of an empire that never saw it coming. Sometimes, the deadliest weapon in war isn't force at all. Sometimes, it's a lie no one thinks to question. Britain never lost Yorktown to a stronger army. It lost Yorktown to a better story, one told with bake ovens, forged letters, and a march no one saw coming until the trap had already closed. If this kind of history hits different when you understand just how close it came to failing, that's exactly you in. Take a second to subscribe, drop a like, and tell us in the comments which deception, ambush, or impossible victory we should break down next. There are a lot more of these waiting.